Every society has its own myths. And those myths can be inspiring and they can even be enlightening when they are looked at in the right way. But one of the most pervasive, and I would say also most toxic as a consequence of this, myths that has gripped the American mind has been the narrative and the story around January 6th, which, as of the posting of this video, that is a commemoration and anniversary of that day that happened a few years ago. I think that January 6th, this myth of January 6th, which has been deliberately created by the political, social, and cultural industrial complex, will go down as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice and one of the greatest abuses of public trust from American institutions in history. Not the greatest. There are plenty of other great abuses of public trust in American history, whether that be the Gulf of Tonkin incident, whether that be all kind of things. But this one is particularly odious. It's odious because this one was approached in a way that, through rhetorical manipulation and clever framing, attempted to criminalize something that is as American as apple pie, and that is dissent. And it did so by attacking Americans' sensibilities on the level of their faith. You see, and I'll explain how this happened in a second, but you see, when we think of something with our intellect, with our reason, we will come to certain conclusions on the basis of our intellect and our reason. But when it comes to a matter of faith, a deeply held, subjective and personal matter, we will not think of that matter in the same way we would if we were using our intellect. And the law enforcement, the corporate media, and the establishments of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, both used terms and phrases that made Americans believe a certain thing on the basis of their faith in our institutions. What do I mean? Very simply, J6 was framed in the following ways. The media called it an attack on democracy, as did law enforcement, and as did establishmentarians in both parties. What do you think Nikki Haley said after it happened? Nikki Haley was about ready to dump President Trump and abandon the idea of MAGA until, of course, that became politically inconvenient for her, so she changed her tune. She's like a chameleon. The establishments of both parties held on to that it was an attack on our democracy. You also heard another phrase uttered by people who were attempting to phrase January 6th in a certain way, and that phrase was that the protesters defiled the sacred Capitol building. There were several politicians, like Chuck Schumer, that were like, this building is sacred. These halls are sacred. The Senate chamber is sacred. These are not rational arguments based on evidence or logic. These are rhetorical devices created in an attempt to manipulate the faith that Americans have in their government, the faith that Americans have in their institutions, the faith that Americans have in the symbol of authority. And by doing that, this simple turn of phrase, an entire group of Americans were duped into believing that this was the worst attack since 9/11. An entire generation of Americans were duped into believing that our democracy, TM, was surely assaulted. An entire group of Americans were duped into believing that this was an attempt to have an insurrection by President Trump. Now, many of us now know, a few years later, the facts are very clear. This was not an insurrection in any meaningful sense of the word. This was a protest that got a little bit rowdy, and this is evidenced, by the way, by the numbers, by the facts. Some may say, Christian, how could you say that? You're being delusional. No, I'm not. The facts are on my side. And facts are stubborn things that a lot of political agents on both sides of the electoral aisle don't want to admit. But according to Axios, which is an establishment publication that is respected by many people in Washington, the number of charges for J6, the overwhelming majority of these charges, were for nonviolent offenses. Not only were they for nonviolent offenses, they were for offenses that didn't even really do anything except exist in an area by proximity. What do I mean? Well, as of August 6, 2023, the vast majority of charges on J6, there were over 1,000 people charged. The vast majority of charges, over 967, were for, and I quote, entering or remaining in a restricted federal building or grounds. So most people at J6, out of the thousands that were there, the vast overwhelming majority were charged simply for walking into a building when they weren't supposed to, allegedly. Is that an insurrection? Let's go down the list. There were about 372 people charged for assaulting, resisting, or impeding officers or employees. Well, that's a big charge. So we can assume that some of the people that have been charged in that charge were charged for assaulting an officer, which is wrong in any case. But some of them may have just been charged for being in the area and not leaving. That could be impeding an officer. It's a vague charge. So let's assume, for good faith, half were violent, half were nonviolent, they were just being nuisance. Okay? We saw the overwhelming majority of people being charged for nonviolent offenses. 310 people were charged for corruptly obstructing, influencing, or impeding an official proceeding or attempting to do so. Is that an insurrection? 64 people were charged for destruction of government property, a very small number. 51 people were charged for theft of government property, a small number. 42 people were charged with conspiracy. Now, for those of you who understand law, conspiracy is one of those charges that the government can kind of just lay on you, but it's very hard to prove in court. Because if you have to hit someone with a conspiracy charge, you have to prove that everyone in that group that you're hitting with the conspiracy charge were actually involved in a conspiracy, and that requires going through several steps of substantiation. This is why when they say that President Trump was involved in a conspiracy, well, you have to get into an intent, and you have to really try to get into someone's mind. Conspiracy charges are very, very hard to prove, but they're a useful tool because most people will not challenge that in court. And 11 people were charged with assaulting a member of the media or destroying their equipment. Out of 1,100 people, only a very small portion were being violent. And yet, this nonviolent behavior has been construed as an attack on democracy, an assault on our sacred capital. And not only that, but Joe Biden praised the arrests of the over 1,100 people and said that they were all insurrectionists and they were all showing hate and all that kind of stuff. Manipulation at the highest level. We can't mistake the role of propaganda in our society if we're trying to understand the cause of this duping and this nonsense. Propaganda is constructed by giving you a very simplified narrative about something, attacking your emotional sentiment, and then driving that home with a particular agenda. This is what Edward Bernays would say, and this is what he did when he was running propaganda for the American government back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the same tactics were employed here with Americans. J6 was really something that was all American in the sense that dissent is fundamentally American. And yet, dissent of an official process, which is fundamentally American, it goes all the way back to the founding generation, dissent of an official process was deemed anti-American, and then it was confronted on that flawed basis. Not only was it deemed anti-American, it was deemed anti-American to the exclusion of any other fact or any other consideration. Once again, a simplified narrative imposed upon the minds of Americans that is not justified on the basis of reason, but on the basis of the heart and faith. I will explain what I mean by that in a second. J6 was truly a political strategy to cause factionalism within the right wing. How so? Because when establishment Republicans and Democrats come together and say, we should not let this happen, this entire event, regardless of the facts and nuance, was violent, was destructive, and was wrong. Regardless of the facts and the nuance, what they're doing is effectively causing dissent within the American right, and then by implication, indicting Donald Trump, who was very clear that he did not want people to go there violently, but protest peacefully. And by indicting him, therefore indicting everyone in his sphere and all of the ideas that come from the MAGA movement. It was a political strategy that was meant to weaponize a simplified narrative of a single event, of a few people at that single event, and then by doing that, dismiss every ideological claim and statement made by MAGA and made by Donald Trump. It was an assault on character, an assault on the mind, and most importantly, an assault on the political process, a massive construct of propaganda. How was all this made possible? Here is the nitty-gritty, my friends. Americans have been taught to deify the government. Americans have been taught by propagandists to view authority and to view the government as some kind of deific force. What I mean? I mean that Americans have been taught to see the government as sacred, divine, and higher than them. This has happened. This has been going on ever since the inception of the progressive era, where Woodrow Wilson and theorists and politicians of that mindset wanted to centralize society and wanted to guide society's processes from on high, rather than listening to dissent and conversation from below. America was never meant to be guided from on high. We were a rejection of that old world idea, and we were an outpouring of potential because we understood that societies run best when individuals can negotiate and love and act on their own terms and not on the terms of the king. And yet this progressivism has come into America, it's affected our universities, it's affected our institutions, and it has made us think that authority is absolute, and that anyone that questions authority must be a conspiracy theorist, which was a term created by the CIA back in the day, or they must be some kind of crank. Authority and consensus are the guiding principles of the era. And yet, it was authority and consensus that has inflicted such harms upon America in many cases. Look at what happened during COVID-19, where authority and consensus both said we had to lock down schools, which has now led to a generation of kids that are irreparably mentally harmed. It was authority and consensus that said we have to separate families and you can't visit your grandmother when she's in the hospital with COVID. And that led to a lot of people's family members dying alone, their last moments spent dying alone. Authority and consensus said, back during the 2001 terrorist attacks, that we need to have a Patriot Act, we need to have a national security state that will indiscriminately monitor and suck up every single communication that you or I have, and then, of course, use it to protect us. When in all reality, it has not done that at all. Authority and consensus have been some of the biggest foes to the security of a free people. And yet, those two things were deified. See, when you say the capital is sacred, what you're saying is that the government is above Americans, and that the government, far from being a material force meant to defend the individual's rights, is some kind of exalted force that's meant to do something much more than that. And when you elevate the government to that kind of level, you lose sight of what the government's purpose is. When you say that it was an attack on our democracy, you introduce a category error by claiming that America is a democracy, when any sound reading of the history of our republic would actually tell us that democracy, whether it's in its mixed form or in its purest form, was absolutely anathema and the opposite of what the founders designed for our system. America was founded off of a classically Republican state, going all the way back to the days of Rome with the idea of res publica, which is simply a political system that enshrines principles in the structure and then balances out those principles through different levels of power being mediated by each other by its internal functions, not a system where the masses are given free reign to tyrannize the minority or tyrannize whoever they want, as was the case in Athens, Greece, and other democracies. But a false understanding of history, a misconception, and indoctrination will tell you, regardless of all these facts, that it was our democracy that was attacked. The intellect would tell you that's not true. But the heart, our faith, the American civic religion that we have in our institutions, the mythologized idea we have of America, that would tell us, oh my, it was an attack on our democracy. No. What happened was a vast manipulation of the faith Americans have in the system. What happened was the deification of the government coming full speed ahead and making a lot of Americans put down their guard and trust what they were being told, what they were seeing on their screens, when in all reality, it was only half the story. What happened was a revealing, an exposure of the blind spot that so many Americans have in their relationship to their government. That the government is not divine. The government is not the supreme authority. The government is meant to be an organ of the people. The people are not the organ of the government, and yet that is how it's seen today. That's what happened on January 6th. That's what was revealed on January 6th. I condemn violence. And anyone who was being violent on that day should face justice. But what I don't condemn is dissent. And what the J6 narrative was an attempt to mythologize a single event to reduce the ability of Americans to dissent against the processes of the government on the basis of some divine idea of government, which is not the case. Everything has a basis, but our government is not divine. That was the vision of the old world, that the king and his agents were the voice of God. The vision of the new world was that the president and the government and the senators and the representatives are all the voice of the people. That is what we're dealing with here, a misrepresentation of the ethos of our country. As I close, I would like to tell all of you that I agree with leftists on one thing, that never forget should be the motto of our day. We should never forget J6 at all. Let's never forget how law enforcement and the media and Congress misused and abused public trust to demonize Americans who exercise their freedom to mistrust the government. Let's never forget how the establishment and both parties deified Capitol Hill as sacred, which by implication elevates politicians above the citizens as opposed to being public servants. Never forget the scores of people who were slandered by association and proximity with the violent people, even though those people were peacefully assembled, the vast majority of them. Never forget that Ray Epps, someone who literally instigated the small portion of violent people to go ahead and do violence, has not faced justice for his behavior. Never forget those that were cast away in the gulags of Washington, D.C. and mistreated without recompense in the name of justice. And never forget the political establishments of both parties that to this day refuse to lift a single finger to help those people that are still locked away in those cages. Never forget the deep level of public distrust in our institutions and the clear attempts to circumvent that distrust through inorganic means by way of rhetorical manipulation and media manipulation by the government. Never forget how that day was used without due process as an excuse to disenfranchise a president and a former president rather, and his entire electoral base, millions of Americans, of their right to select a candidate according to their own conscience, not according to the narratives of the government. Never forget January 6th. Let it live on forever in your memories and your minds and your souls as a reminder that the political, media, cultural, industrial complex is the greatest foe to the security of a free people and the goodwill of Americans. Never forget that day. Because if you do forget, my friends, as the old adage says, as cliched as it is, I don't care. History will repeat itself. But the best thing is, a lot of people are not going to forget. A lot of folks, even those that are mired in the establishment worldview, are realizing just how misled they were about this day. A lot of folks are waking up, and that should give you hope. We need a revolution of the mind, one that will adhere to the facts over subjective opinions, one that will have a healthy skeptical distrust of authority, because authority is governed by the norms of power, not by first principles. And anything governed by the norms of power will seek to preserve itself and keep itself intact, even if that means defying morality and defying its proper limits. Let us all have a stronger base in philosophy so we can channel that 1776 spirit and use it to correct our government when necessary and to refine our system so that it can best reflect the desires of the founding generation all the way back a few hundred years ago, who were based on eternal principles, not temporal ideas. Let us never forget J6. And let us use the fact that we now understand how this propaganda works to forge a better society and a more perfect union. We can do it, my friends. We just must have the gall, we must have the temerity, we must have the grit. Signed dutifully, a Gen C right-leaning observer. My friends, I love you guys so much. Like this video, comment on this video, share this video, subscribe to my channel. Be sure to donate to me if you want to. All that information is in the comment section down below. Please, please, please share this with your friends. Get this message out there because we need to have a revolution of the mind. We need to inform more people of what's going on. My friends, I love you guys so much and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.